The station was already dying when Kale found her. He almost didn't stop. That was the honest truth of it. The part he'd never say out loud at a bar, or tell to anyone who hadn't been out here long enough to understand what the deep routes did to a person. You learn to read a ship or a station the way an old farmer reads the sky, the color of the venting plasma, the pitch of the hull groan, the particular silence that meant life support had already given up and was just coasting on inertia. Way Station Pell had all three. The plasma venting from the port coupling was the wrong shade of orange, too bright at the edges, which meant the filtration pack had cracked. The hull groaned in a low-frequency register that he could feel in his back teeth, and the communications array was silent, in the way that stations were only silent when there was nobody left to open a channel. He almost flew past. Then the emergency beacon triggered, not the automated distress pulse that any dead station threw on its way to silence, but the personal locator kind, the kind that required a living hand to activate, the kind that required someone who still wanted to be found. Kale Morrow was 34 years old, had been running freight on deep space routes since he was 19, and had been broke in 11 different currencies, shot twice, stabbed once, and left for dead on a moon that didn't have a name on any official chart. He was, by all conventional measures, not a man who stopped for trouble. He dropped out of transit speed and brought his ship, the Mira's Luck, around on a hard burn. Later, he would tell himself it was the beacon. That was part of it. But the truth was that the station's dying groan reminded him of a sound he'd heard once before, the particular harmonic of a ship losing pressure in the forward compartment, a sound he'd been 11 years old when he first heard it. And that sound had meant Vetch was hurt, and the memory of that moment still lived in the back of his sternum, like a splinter that had never fully worked its way out. He docked on the emergency coupling and cut through the inner airlock with the plasma cutter he kept strapped to the inside of the cargo bay door. A habit Vetch had drilled into him so many times that the motion was as automatic as breathing. The station's interior was dark except for the emergency strips along the floor, that particular bloodless red that emergency lighting always was, as though the designers had decided that if things had gotten this bad, warmth was no longer a priority. She was in the communications bay, which was why the array had been silent. She was sitting in front of the main console with both hands pressed flat against the transmitter panel, and the transmitter panel was dark because she was what had been powering it. He could see the faint luminescence along her forearms fading as her body hit the limit of what it could sustain. She was small, maybe 5 feet standing, though she was currently folded against the console in a posture that suggested something structural had gone wrong with her left side. Her skin was the pale gray-green of something deep ocean, and her eyes, when she turned toward him, were enormous and black and without visible pupil, the kind of eyes that gave humans a specific, evolutionarily ancient feeling of discomfort. She said something in a language he didn't have. He held up both hands, palms out. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, which was something he'd said in 6 or 7 alien languages over the years, and had learned to say with his hands first, because hands crossed species lines in a way that phonemes did not. She looked at him for a long moment, then she reached out one hand, and before he could step back, touched his wrist. He felt it like a key turning in a lock he hadn't known was there. Not pain, something much stranger than pain. A sensation like every feeling he had ever pressed down and gotten practical about suddenly surfacing at once, briefly and completely, the way a body of water will show you the whole sky if you look at it from the right angle. He felt the specific ache of missing Vetch, which was constant and had been constant for 3 years, and which he had become so accustomed to that he no longer consciously recognized it as wait. He felt the loneliness of the long routes. He felt something that had no precise name, but that lived in the part of him that had been 11 years old on a half-dead ship with a man bleeding in the co-pilot's chair, humming an old Earth song because it was the only thing Kale could think of to do, and that humming had become something Kale had never fully been able to leave behind. The reflex of filling silence with music when everything else was going wrong. She pulled her hand back. Her enormous eyes were wet. "You," she said, in accented but recognizable trade standard. "Hurt. Much hurt. Carry long time." "I'm fine," Kale said, which was the only possible response. She looked at him in a way that told him she had just felt the full internal record of the past 3 years, and was not particularly convinced by his assessment. Her name was Senna. She was of a species that called themselves the Veil, and what Kale had experienced when she touched him was the basic mode of Veil perception. They did not shake hands. They did not exchange names first. They reached out and felt the shape of a person's emotional interior the way a doctor palpates for a broken bone. She had been on Waystation Pell for 9 days, which was 7 days longer than she'd intended. The explosion that killed the station's crew had also broken 4 of her ribs, which were, he discovered when he got her back to the Mira's luck and did a basic medical scan, floating rather than cracked, which was somehow worse than it sounded. I need to take you somewhere with a real medical bay, Kale said. I need to reach the Covenant of Woven Paths, she said. It is very important. My people will die real without the information I carry. Kale looked at her. He looked at the medical scan. He thought about the route he was supposed to be running, which was a pharmaceutical cargo to the transit station at Helos IV that would pay him enough to cover the Mira's Luck's next engine maintenance cycle, and also to buy himself 4 consecutive nights in something with actual gravity and a bed that wasn't bolted to a bulkhead. Where is the Covenant of Woven Paths, he said. She told him. It was in the opposite direction from Helos IV, by approximately 12 hours at transit speed. He looked at the scan again. He looked at her. He thought about Vetch, which was not a thought he had chosen to have. It arrived on its own, with no invitation. The way that memories of people you have loved and lost have a habit of arriving exactly when the universe is presenting you with a decision. I'll need to make a stop first, he said. There's a medical relay at Dusk Point. You need bone sealing before those ribs shift any further. She looked at him in that way again, the full contact reading, the assessment of a person's emotional interior, and this time he didn't step back. You are afraid, she said, but you will help. I'm not afraid, Kale said. You are afraid you will help, and something will go wrong, and it will feel like the last time you tried to help and lost someone, she said. But you will do it anyway. That is not the absence of fear. That is a different thing. He thought about arguing. He decided against it. He went to the cockpit and plotted the course to Dusk Point. The Mira's Luck was not, technically speaking, a ship designed for passengers. It was a Class 4 courier vessel, modified for extended solo runs, which meant the second bunk in the crew quarters had been converted into an equipment rack and the galley was barely large enough for one person to stand in. Kale moved the equipment rack back into the cargo bay and gave Senna the bunk with a matter-of-factness that he hoped communicated practicality, rather than sentimentality, because he was not sentimental. Vetch had been very clear on this point. Boy, Vetch had said to him, more than once, on the bridge of the old ship that Kale had spent his adolescence on, the surest way to die out here is to let your feelings make your decisions for you. He had said this while on 2 separate occasions reversing course to pull strangers out of bad situations for no profit and considerable risk. Kale had eventually concluded that what Vetch meant was not don't feel things, but rather don't talk about feeling them, which was a distinction that had shaped him in ways he was still working out. He heated a ration pack for Senna and left it on the small folding shelf by the bunk. She ate it with a seriousness of attention that suggested she hadn't had food since before the station's power had failed. What is this? She asked, holding up the ration pack's outer foil. Protein reclaim with flavor additives, Kale said. The flavor additives are technically optional, but I've found they make the process of eating it easier to complete. It tastes of something chemical and also faintly of something sweet. That's the synthetic vanilla. The company says it's vanilla adjacent. I don't know what that means either. She looked at him. She was still reading him, he understood. Not always deliberately, but the way that hearing people can't stop processing sound. Your species puts a great deal of effort into making bad things bearable. That's one way to put it. It is admirable, and also a little sad. Most true things are, Kale said, and went back to the cockpit. He flew for a while without thinking about anything in particular, which was one of the skills he had developed over 15 years on solo routes. The ability to be present in the cockpit without being present in his own head. The stars outside the viewport were the same stars they always were, beautiful and cold and utterly indifferent, and, because of all that, somehow comforting. The universe did not care about him in a way that he had always found oddly liberating. The indifference cut in both directions. If the universe didn't care whether he succeeded, it also didn't care whether he failed. It had no preference. The meaning was entirely on his side, which meant the meaning was entirely his to assign, which meant that stopping for a beacon on a dying station was as legitimate a use of a life as any other. Vetch had understood this. He had never articulated it. Vetch articulated almost nothing that mattered, operating instead through a pattern of actions that demonstrated his values better than any speech could have. But Kale had felt it in the way Vetch moved through decisions, without agonizing, without performing the calculus of risk versus benefit out loud. He saw what needed doing, and he did it, and the doing was the whole argument. Kale had spent years trying to get back to that simplicity and had mostly failed, and had settled for approximating it. Feel the thing, assess the situation, do the next right move. Repeat. Accept that you will sometimes get it wrong. Do it anyway. He checked the navigation. 2 hours to dusk point. He turned up the heater in the crew quarters by 2 degrees, because whatever Vale physiology was like, floating ribs in the cold seemed like a bad combination. He didn't mention that he had done it. He filed it in the category of things that didn't need to be announced. They stopped at Dusk Point, which was a medical relay station that also served as a trading post, and informally a meeting place for the various scavengers, couriers, and independent operators who ran the deep routes. The bone sealing took 40 minutes and cost Kale enough to put a meaningful dent in what Hellas IV was going to pay him, which he had already made peace with before he walked through the medical bay's door. He sat in the waiting area and found himself humming something old, something his mother had sung when he was small, before the colony, before Vetch, before Earth had become a place he remembered in fragments rather than in lived geography. The tune didn't have words anymore, or rather the words had gone, and the melody had stayed, which was how it worked with the things that were earliest in you. In the waiting area, a Torvan merchant with 3 sets of arms was watching him with an expression that might have been curiosity. What does that sound? The merchant asked. A song, Kale said. Your species makes sound with the mouth for emotional regulation, also for fun, Kale said. Sometimes for both at once. The merchant considered this. We have been told that humans are an anomalous species, that you are too biologically fragile for deep space travel, too short-lived for the long routes, too psychologically variable for reliable commercial partnerships. And yet, he gestured at Kale with one of his secondary arms. Here you are. Here I am, Kale agreed. How do you manage it? The fragility. Kale thought about this seriously, because it was a serious question asked by someone who seemed to genuinely want an answer. We carry things with us, he said at last. Songs, memories, people who aren't there anymore. We have a talent for traveling with the dead. The merchant was quiet for a moment. That sounds very heavy. It is, Kale said, but it also means we're never really alone, which helps when the routes get long. Senna came out of the medical bay moving more carefully, but with less of the glazed-eye quality that broken ribs caused. She looked at Kale. She did not touch him, because she was learning to ask first. He had, gently and without accusation, mentioned that it was a lot, the touching, and she had immediately understood in the way that people who feel everything understand accommodation. Can we go now? She asked. Can we go now? Kale confirmed and stood, and they went. The route to the Covenant of Woven Paths took them through a region of space that the navigational charts labeled the Unmarked Passage, which was the kind of name that routes got when the people who charted them had decided that accuracy was less important than honesty about the general experience of traveling there. The Unmarked Passage was a region of heavy subspace interference, which meant transit jumps were shorter and less reliable, and you spent more time in normal space looking at stars that were far enough away to be beautiful and close enough to nothing else to be isolating. They talked in the way that two people on a small ship for an extended period inevitably do. Not the talking of people who have decided to talk, but the talking that fills the gaps between tasks, the kind that starts with practical exchanges and becomes, slowly, the kind of exchange where both parties are saying things that matter to them without necessarily announcing that this is what is happening. Senna told him about the Veil. They were an old species, she said. Old in the way that species were old when they had lived long enough to watch the galaxy change around them. They had no weapons, had never had weapons in the traditional sense, because their capacity for empathic contact meant that hurting another being caused them a degree of reciprocal pain that functioned as a physiological deterrent to violence. What they had instead was knowledge. They were historians, witnesses, the kind of species that other species brought their conflicts to when arbitration was needed, because a being who could feel the full weight of your grief and the full weight of your opponent's grief simultaneously was, in practice, very useful for finding the ground between positions. That sounds exhausting, Kale said. Yes, Senna said, simply and without self-pity. Do you ever get to turn it off? No, but I have learned to categorize. Your species' emotional signature is quite distinct. You feel everything very quickly and then immediately try to do something practical about it. Is that unusual? Extremely. Most species either feel slowly or do not immediately translate feeling into action. With humans, the translation is almost simultaneous. You feel fear and immediately begin planning. You feel grief and immediately begin moving toward the next thing you need to do. We have studied your species a little, and we do not fully understand the mechanism. The mechanism, Kale said, is that we're fragile and we know it. When you're fragile, staying still is dangerous, so you feel the thing and then you get up. Senna was quiet for a moment. Vetch taught you this? He hadn't mentioned Vetch since the medical station. He modeled it, Kale said. He wasn't the kind of person who explained things in words. He raised you. He found me. I was 8. He'd been hired to deliver cargo to a colony on the outer rim, and my parents were on that colony when it was hit. He wasn't supposed to take me. It wasn't in any contract. Kale stopped. He just did. For about a year, I thought it was temporary, that he was going to find somewhere to put me down that was appropriate and official. He never did. He kept you because he loved you. He never said that. He didn't need to say it, Senna said. He kept you in a place where keeping you was difficult and inconvenient and potentially legally complicated for years until you were old enough and skilled enough that you didn't need to be kept. That is not a thing you do for strangers out of obligation. Kale looked at the starfield through the cockpit glass. He had had this thought before, many times had arrived at this exact conclusion and then moved past it because the practical consequence of accepting it fully was a grief that required time he hadn't always had. He died 3 years ago, Kale said. Went back for a crew member on a ship that was breaking up. Made it out with the crew member. Didn't make it out himself. Senna said nothing. But she reached across the co-pilot's console and rested the back of her hand on the back of his hand. Not the direct contact of a reading, just the simple pressure of proximity, the gesture that meant I am here and I heard that. He let it stay there for a few seconds. Then he reached for the navigation panel, which needed adjusting anyway, and the moment passed into the general fabric of the journey. The information Senna carried was not, it turned out, stored in any data format that required a device. It was in her. The Veil had a form of biological memory encoding that operated through their empathic architecture. Memories of sufficient emotional weight became part of their body's signal, transmissible through direct contact. She was the message. What she carried was a record of what she had witnessed on a dead world in the outer passage, a world called Teth's Rest that had been, 8 months ago, the home of a civilization of approximately 60 million. It was not a home anymore. The civilization was not 60 million anymore. The confluence had been there. She told him about it in the clinical language she used when she was containing something large, the language of someone who had learned to describe terrible things in careful words because the alternative was being swallowed by them. The confluence was the name her people had given to an entity that the affected civilizations generally had no name for because they had no time to develop one before they ceased to exist as separate entities. It was, as best the Veil had been able to determine over several centuries of distant observation, a living intelligence of planetary scale that had, at some point in its ancient past, solved the problem of loneliness in the worst possible way, by simply absorbing everything else. It grows itself outward, Senna said, extensions of its body, tendrils but on a scale, filaments of living material that penetrate a world's soil, its water, its air. Over a period of months, the biological life of the planet begins to change, to align, to resonate with its frequency. And then, she stopped. The people of Teth's Rest called it the singing sickness first. They thought it was a disease. They treated the symptoms. They did not understand what was underneath the symptoms until it was too late. They got absorbed. Their consciousness, their memory, their language, their ways of being consumed, integrated. There is a version of them inside the confluence now, and that version has no capacity for resistance because it is not separate. They are part of it. They cannot want anything it does not want. They cannot remember being anything it was not. She paused. That is what the Veil fear most, not death, absorption, the ending of separateness. Where is it now? Kale asked. Senna looked at him. This is what I carry. This is why I must reach the Covenant. The Confluence's next tendril network is already extending. It is moving toward the Helion cluster. Kale thought about the Helion cluster. It had 47 inhabited worlds. He had run freight through it for 6 years. How long? He asked. The Veil Seers estimate 8 months before full penetration, 2 months before the first symptoms. The first worlds it will reach are the smaller ones at the cluster's edge. Caleth, Kale said, because Caleth was the first world at the cluster's edge. It had a population of about 3 million. He had been there 17 times, and he knew a woman there who ran a docking bay and who always gave him a fair rate on fuel, and who had a daughter who was maybe 9 years old, and who had, the last time Kale was there, spent 20 minutes explaining to him in great detail and with considerable passion why a particular species of caterpillar was the most important organism in the known universe. He had listened to the whole 20 minutes. He had meant to go back and hear what she'd concluded about the caterpillar. Caleth, Senna confirmed. Kale reached for the navigation panel. He adjusted their heading, adding 2 hours to the journey, not toward the Covenant of Woven Paths, toward a communications relay that he knew was operational, that he knew had a long-range tight beam transmitter powerful enough to reach the Helion cluster's emergency network. What are you doing? Senna asked. Calling some people, Kale said. The Covenant is the official channel, and it matters. But warning the people who are actually on those worlds matters faster. You don't know that anyone will listen. No, Kale said. But I also don't know that they won't, and the cost of trying is 2 hours. The cost of not trying is that I find out later I could have warned Kaleth and chose not to because I didn't want to detour. Senna looked at him. She was reading him, he could tell, the involuntary reception, the empathic antenna that she couldn't fully switch off. Whatever she was receiving, it settled something in her expression. Not surprise. Recognition. You are very human, she said. It was the most complete compliment he had ever received. They reached the communications relay, and Kale opened every channel he had credentials for, which were more channels than any legitimate courier needed, a fact that would have been awkward to explain to a customs official, but which Vetch had always maintained were a professional necessity. He sent warnings in 6 languages to the Helion Cluster Emergency Network, to the Independent Operators Consortium, to 3 separate freight guilds that had members running routes through the cluster, and to a specific personal address on Kaleth that he was fairly certain was still operational, addressed to a woman named Dara who ran a docking bay and who had a daughter who cared very much about caterpillars. He did not know if any of it would land. He knew the emergency network was patchy, that the freight guilds were slow to act on unverified intelligence, that personal messages into the cluster could take 6 to 14 hours to route. He sent everything he had anyway, because the weight of not sending it was heavier than the weight of uncertainty about whether it would matter. He also added something to the transmissions that Senna had not suggested, and that he would not have been able to fully justify if pressed for a logical argument. He added a brief account of Teth's rest, not the clinical record, not the numbers, but the specific things Senna had told him in the unguarded moments of the journey. The name of the dominant art form that had existed there, the fact that they had made sculptures of light, the particular sentence Senna had used when describing the silence that had replaced them. He added it because he thought there was a difference between warning people about a threat and warning people about what the threat meant, and the difference mattered. People could be slow to act against statistics. They were faster to act against the silencing of light sculpting. Now, he said to Senna, we go to the Covenant. She looked at the additions he'd made to the transmissions, the parts about the art, the light, the silence. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, that was not in my briefing to you. No, Kale said. How did you know to include it? Because I've spent 15 years trying to get people to act on cargo manifests, Kale said. The manifests that get responded to are those ones that tell you what's in the hold, and also why it matters. He paused. Also because if I were on Kaleth and something was coming for me, I'd want to know it had already eaten the light sculptors of Teth's Rest. That would make it real in a way that numbers don't. Senna was quiet. Then she said very quietly, yes, it would. The Covenant of Woven Paths was not a place in the conventional sense. It was a meeting structure, a collection of ships and stations and ad hoc platforms held in gravitational balance around a point in space that had been, by ancient treaty, declared neutral territory. It was where the old species came when things were large enough to require witness. It was where the veil had been bringing the shape of unfolding disasters for centuries, and where, centuries ago, collective responses had been organized, and where, more recently, collective responses had mostly been discussed, agreed upon in principle, deferred pending further information, returned to committee, and discussed again. Kale had been to the Covenant once before on a cargo run. He remembered the scale of it, the sheer number of ships, the architectural diversity of the station platforms, the particular energy of a place that was very important, and also very old, and also somewhat ineffective at translating importance into urgency. He liked it less this time. Senna had contacts here, a Vale embassy ship, a senior historian who had been expecting her, a protocol for receiving her information and transmitting it to the decision-making bodies. Kale walked her through the docking process, carried her medical supplies because she was still moving carefully, and stood at the edge of the Vale embassy's reception chamber while Senna was received by her people. The senior historian was an older Vale, with the grayed-out undertone that their skin developed with age, and the particular stillness of someone who had spent a very long time learning to hold what they received without being broken by it. He touched Senna's hands and stood very still for a long moment. Then he looked at Kale with those enormous black eyes. You brought her, he said. She did most of the work, Kale said. I just provided the ship. She was found injured and alone. You stopped. There was a beacon. Many ships pass beacons, the historian said. He looked at Kale with the particular attention of someone who was doing best not to read a person without permission. Will you stay? The Covenant will need to be briefed. It will be useful to have a non-veil voice. The Council of Many Species moves more quickly when the species of the affected regions are present. Kale thought about the Helosa 4 cargo run. He thought about the engine maintenance cycle. He thought about the pharmaceutical company that was waiting on its delivery and had already, technically, paid a deposit. I'll stay, he said. He stayed for 8 days, which was 6 days longer than he'd intended, because the Covenant moved with the speed of an entity that had been reaching consensus for centuries and had developed no particular urgency about doing it faster. Kale sat in sessions that lasted 6 hours and produced 4 paragraphs of agreed language and 3 requests for additional verification. He spoke when asked about the Helion cluster, described Kaleth, described the other worlds, described the texture of life in places that the Council knew as coordinates and he knew as people. He was not a diplomat. He had no training in the protocols of multi-species address. He said things plainly, and sometimes the plainness landed in ways that careful, diplomatic language did not. On the 4th day, in a session that had been circling a consensus on whether to issue a formal alert, Kale stood up without waiting to be called on, which was not protocol, and said, "The world at the edge of the cluster is going to show its first symptoms in roughly 2 months. There are 3 million people on it. At least one of them is a 9-year-old girl who I promised I'd come back to, and I have not been back yet. I understand this is not a formal argument. I'm telling you anyway, because formal arguments seem to be taking a long time, and 9-year-old girls don't." There was silence. Then the Covenant's moderator, a 7-limbed being of considerable ancient authority, said, "We will put the alert to vote." The alert passed. It was not everything. It was not the coordinated defensive response that the situation ultimately required, but it was the first formal thing, and formal things had to start somewhere. And Kale understood enough about how large structures move to know that this was meaningful even if it was insufficient. Senna found him afterward in the corridor outside the session chamber. "You did not follow protocol," she said. "No. It worked. It worked this time," he said. "I wouldn't recommend it as a reliable strategy. What you said, about the girl on Kaleth. I know. It was manipulative." "It was true," Senna said. "True and manipulative are not mutually exclusive." He almost smiled. "No, they're not." She looked at him with the consideration she gave to things she was deciding whether to say. "I am going to stay here, with my people. There is more work to do with the Covenant, and I am the one who carries the record. But you should go. There are things you are needed for that this chamber cannot address." "Like what?" "Like going back to Kaleth," she said. "Like keeping the promise you made to come back. Like being the kind of presence in the places the Covenant cannot reach in time." "I'm a courier," Kale said. "I run freight." "You are also," Senna said carefully, "the kind of person who stops when a beacon triggers on a dying station. The kind of person who detours 2 hours to send warnings that may or may not be received. The kind of person who stands up in a session of the Covenant of Woven Paths without permission and tells 300-year-old alien diplomats about a 9-year-old girl's interest in caterpillars." She paused. "Your species has a word for this, I think. Vetch would know it." Kale thought about what Vetch would say. Vetch would say something gruff and practical that was also, underneath the gruffness and practicality, the most direct possible expression of a fundamental position. He would probably say something like, "Boy, the universe is full of people who know when something is wrong and decide it's not their job. Don't be those people." He had said that, in fact, almost exactly those words, on a ship that smelled of engine coolant and recycled air, to an 11-year-old boy who was humming to fill the silence because he didn't know what else to do. "I'll go back to Kaleth," Kale said. "But first I have a cargo run I'm already 3 weeks late on." Senna almost smiled. Of course. Before he left the Covenant, a Vale elder he hadn't spoken to directly approached him in the corridor near the docking ring. She was very old. Her skin was almost white, the gray having gone all the way through, and her eyes had developed the particular depth of eyes that had seen a great many things and processed them over a very long time. She did not touch him, but she looked at him with an attention that felt, even without contact, like being read. "The human," she said. "That's me," Kale said. "You feel things very noisily," she said, "even from here, even without contact. Your emotional output is significant, I've been told. What I am receiving from you," she said, "is not primarily what I expected from a human in a situation like this one. I expected fear. I expected urgency. I expected the particular frequency of someone who is trying to save something. She paused. What I am receiving instead is grief, deep and old, and beneath the grief, something else. What purpose? She said. Purpose that grew from the grief rather than despite it. The grief is not separate from why you are here. It is the reason you are here. She was quiet for a moment. We have very few records of species whose tragedy becomes their engine. Most species are either broken by loss or avoid it sufficiently that it does not become central. Humans, she stopped. I have been a witness for 240 years. I have never felt anything like what I receive from a human being. The depth of it, the way you hold it and still move. We don't have much choice, Kale said. You have every choice, she said gently. That is the point. You have the choice to be broken by it, or to not feel it, or to become cold. Many species make those choices. You, as a species, make the other one. Not always, not without cost, but with a consistency that is remarkable. She paused again. I wanted you to know that. Before you left, Kale stood in the corridor of the Covenant for a moment after she had gone, surrounded by the sounds and light of the oldest diplomatic structure in the known galaxy, thinking about a man with blue skin and a pointed fin on the back of his head who had picked up an 8-year-old from the wreckage of a colony and had never explained why and had never needed to. Then he went to his ship and filed the cargo manifest and flew toward Helos IV. The Helian cluster sat in a region of space that was older than most of its inhabitants had any intuitive sense of an ancient arrangement of stars that had been burning. When the first beings in this galaxy had looked up and decided that looking up was something worth doing. 47 worlds, each one different in the way that worlds separated by hundreds of years of independent history were different from each other. Different languages, different architectures, different ways of marking time and celebrating it, different foods and different music, and different arguments about which of those things mattered most. Kale had been through many of them. He had eaten food he could not identify in establishments that had no English equivalent signage and had found most of it at least interesting, and some of it genuinely good. He had once spent 4 hours in a rainstorm on a world called Sethiel, waiting for a cargo collection that was delayed, listening to a street musician play an instrument that had no name in trade standard, on a corner that smelled of rain and something flowering, and had thought, this is a good place. Humans had not made this place. Humans were not necessary to this place, but it was a good place. He reached Culleth 3 days after leaving the Covenant, which was approximately 60 days before Senna's estimate for first symptoms. He docked at Dara's Bay, paid for fuel and a berth, and found that his message had been received. Dara, who was a practical woman with an eye for the things that actually mattered, had already started talking to the Planetary Health Network about the veil warning. People think it's overcaution, she said. They were in the docking bay office, which had a window that looked out over the landing pads and the city beyond them, a particular kind of city that grew on worlds with a slightly denser atmosphere, lower buildings, more horizontal spread, everything slightly softer at the edges. Nobody wants to hear that something's coming, especially something that doesn't blow things up. It doesn't arrive with warships. It just changes things slowly until you don't notice you've changed. That's exactly why it's dangerous, Kale said. I know that. You know that. The people I've been talking to at the health network know that. We've started monitoring the soil composition on the outer ring. 4 monitoring stations, which is not enough, but is what we can get operational in the next 3 weeks. She looked at him. Is it as bad as the Veil Witness says? The world I looked up, Kale said. Teth's Rest. I found 3 historical records on it before it went silent. It had 60 million people. It had a tradition of light sculpting. I saw some of it in an archive, the way they'd shape bioluminescent material into. It was beautiful. Completely unlike anything I'd seen before. It's gone now, all of it. The people, the tradition, the language, the specific way they laughed at things. All of it is inside the confluence now and it can't get out. Dara was quiet. Outside the window, a ship was coming in on final approach, its running lights blinking against the morning sky. My daughter wants to talk to you, she said. She heard you were back. She's been working on her caterpillar thesis. I want to hear it, Kale said, and meant it. Her name was Mira, which was the same as his ship's, which was a coincidence he decided not to examine too carefully. She was 9 years old and had the specific kind of focused energy of a child who had found something genuinely interesting and intended to make sure you understood why. She explained the caterpillar, a native species to Coleth's outer forest belt that had, in her view, an underappreciated role in the soil chemistry of the planet's northern biome. For the better part of 40 minutes while Kale ate something Dara had made and listened with the full and genuine attention that the explanation deserved. The thing about them, Mira said, with the earnestness of someone presenting a conclusion she'd worked hard to reach, is that they're not impressive. They don't do anything that looks important. They're just there, in the soil, doing the thing they do. But if you take them out, everything that depends on the soil starts to fail. Not right away. Slowly. You don't see it happening until it's already happened. Kale looked at her for a moment. That's very true, he said, of a lot of things. That's what I think, she said, satisfied. He stayed on Kaleth for 3 days. He helped Dara's contact at the health network draft a species alert protocol that was specific enough to be actionable and general enough to be transmitted to the other worlds in the cluster. He used the Freight Guild connections he had to get the protocol distributed to the 47 worlds. On his last day, Mira asked him if he was coming back. Yes, he said. I'll be back. How do you know? He thought about it. I don't, he said, but I'll try. And trying is the part I'm responsible for. She nodded, apparently satisfied with this ontological position. Okay, she said. I'll have more about the caterpillars by then. I'm going to study the ones in the eastern sector next. I'll look forward to it, Kale said. He was halfway to his next freight pickup, a mining station near the inner edge of the outer passage, when the second beacon triggered. It came through on the same personal frequency he'd given Senna during the Covenant stay, which meant it had been relayed through Vale communications infrastructure, which meant someone had gone to the considerable trouble of routing it through an alien diplomatic network to reach him specifically. He almost didn't answer. It was not Senna. It was a Valefield witness whose name translated roughly as Thorn in the Wader, and who was transmitting from a position that his navigation system recognized as being approximately 40 light minutes from the outer edge of the Helium Cluster's second world, a place called Irith, a world of 300,000 people, primarily agricultural, which had been Senna's second entry on the list of worlds that would show symptoms first. The confluence filaments have penetrated Irith's surface layer, Thorn in the Wader said. He spoke trade standard with precision, the accent of someone who had learned it from documentation rather than conversation. Penetration is estimated at 6%. This is earlier than projected. The Vale Seers believe the confluence has accelerated its process in response to the formal alert from the Covenant. It is aware that it has been named, and named things move differently than unnamed things. Kale sat with this for a moment. It knows we warned them. It is not clear whether knowing is the correct term for what the confluence does. But yes, the alert and the protocols and the soil monitoring stations, it has registered resistance, and it has responded by moving faster. How much faster? The original estimate of 8 months to full cluster penetration has been revised. The current projection is 11 weeks. 11 weeks. 11 weeks for 47 worlds, 3 million of them on Kaleth alone, one of them a 9-year-old girl who had more research to do on the caterpillars in the eastern sector. What can be done? Kale asked. The Covenant is in session. The Vale are transmitting the revised projections. There is discussion of. Thorn in the Wader paused in a way that communicated something that might have been frustration, though Vale facial expressions were not fully readable to Kale. Discussion. Yes, Kale said. There is a lot of that. He looked at the navigation panel. He looked at the projected course to the mining station. He thought about the freight client. He thought about the engine maintenance cycle. He thought about Vetch, who had never spent time thinking about things like freight clients and engine maintenance cycles when something important was actually in front of him. Vetch had understood priority at a biological level, which was perhaps the most important skill anyone who operated in the deep routes could develop. I'm going to Irith, Kale said. That is not a safe position, Thorn the Wader said. 6% penetrations means the confluence is active. Any long-term exposure at the surface may result in symptoms. How long is long-term? For a human? Unknown. The confluence has not previously attempted absorption of a human. Your biology is. The Vale hesitated. Different. Different how? Another pause. The Seers have been discussing this. When the formal alert went through the Covenant systems, and we began compiling species-specific vulnerability assessments, humans were categorized under the standard biological framework for carbon-based sapience. But the framework did not produce a meaningful result. The variables that the confluence uses to model a species' susceptibility to resonance, matching, the variables that make absorption possible, they depend on a certain psychological consistency, a certain stability of self-concept, a predictability of emotional signature. Thorn in the Wader seemed to be choosing his words carefully. Humans do not have this. Your emotional signatures are not unstable, but non-uniform. You feel things that contradict each other simultaneously. You carry grief and joy together. You are afraid and also determined. You grieve someone and also find them funny and also miss them and also are angry about losing them. All at the same moment, all in the same person. The confluence models have no entry for this. It cannot predict the matching frequency for a being whose frequency changes this rapidly and in this many directions. Kell thought about this. It can't absorb what it can't predict. That is the hypothesis the seers are working from. Yes, it is not confirmed. But you asked how humans are different, and that is the current answer. Kale thought about the old Vale elder in the corridor at the Covenant, the one who had said, "Your emotional output is significant." The one who had said, "I have never felt anything like what I receive from a human being." "I'm going to Irith," he said again. Irith was an agricultural world in the way that words like agricultural sometimes failed to capture not the monolithic grain plains of an industrial producer, but a world whose food was grown in 1,000 different ways by 1,000 different communities, each with their own practices and varieties, a complex patchwork of ecosystems that had been developed over 4 centuries of settlement. From orbit, it looked green gold in a way that was different from most green worlds. The specific warmth of a world where the light came through at a particular angle and the crops caught it at the right moment. It was beautiful in the quiet way of working things. On the ground, the 6% penetration was not visible to the naked eye. That was the point. That was always the point. You could not see it until you were measuring. The monitoring station data showed it in the soil chemistry readings. A slight alkalinity shift in the outer fields, a microscopic change in the mycorrhizal network, a frequency in the subsurface that instruments caught, and that biological life, given enough time, would begin to match. Kit landed at the main settlement's cargo pad and spent 3 days working alongside the agricultural station's chief scientist, a Helian woman named Dr. Yeva Moss, who had 3 doctorates in xenobiology and had spent 20 years studying the cluster's soil, ecosystems, and who was, in Kale's assessment, the kind of person who the universe occasionally produced when it decided a specific problem needed solving. She was not particularly interested in diplomatic protocols or covenant alerts or formal threat assessments. She was interested in what the confluence was actually doing to the mycorrhizal network at the molecular level and what the fastest possible interruption mechanism would be. The thing is, she said on the second day, in a way that suggested she had been thinking through the night and had arrived at something, the confluence isn't destroying the existing network. It's hijacking it. It's using the fungal communication channels that are already there, because they're already there, because they evolved here over centuries, because they're perfectly adapted to this soil chemistry. It's using the infrastructure that exists. Can you change the infrastructure? Kale asked. You can't change 47 worlds of soil chemistry in 11 weeks, she said. But you don't have to. You just have to make the existing network louder than the confluence's signal. She pulled up a diagram on her station's display, a dense network map overlaid with what looked like 2 competing wave patterns. The mycorrhizal network transmits at a specific biological frequency. The confluence is gradually shifting that frequency to match its own. If I can introduce a counter signal at the source, something that reinforces the native frequency and makes it resistant to the shift. She stopped. The problem is the delivery mechanism. I can engineer the counter signal, but to introduce it at scale across the outer fields, I need a distribution system that the soil biology will accept, and I need it in. She looked at the penetration data, days, not weeks. Kale looked at the diagram. He thought about Vetch, who had been an extremely creative problem solver in situations where the available resources were significantly less than the situation technically required. Vetch had once repaired a failed guidance system with 3 components from a broken environmental processor, a segment of power conduit, and what had originally been a component of the ship's food replicator. He had done it under fire and with a laceration on his left forearm, and while explaining to a 12-year-old Kale exactly what he was doing and why, as though the emergency were also a teaching opportunity. The irrigation network, Kale said. You've got a water delivery system that already reaches the outer fields. Yeva looked at him. Then she looked at the diagram. Then she looked at him again. The municipal irrigation management system is about 40 years old and operates on a completely different set of protocols from anything my lab equipment uses, she said. The interface conversion would take, do you have a technician who knows the irrigation system? I have 3. Then let's get them in the same room as your signal engineering team, Kale said. And let's find out what it takes to make the old thing talk to the new thing, because we have days and not weeks, and that system is already in the ground. She stared at him. You're a freight courier. I'm a freight courier who has been adapting incompatible systems to work together for 15 years, Kale said. It's most of the job, actually. The interface conversion took 36 hours, 3 complete redesigns, 2 catastrophic failures at the testing stage, one moment where the entire system went dark and everyone in the room went very quiet, and one moment where it came back online and everyone in the room did not go quiet at all. The counter signal distribution went into the Irith irrigation network at approximately 4 in the morning, local time, while Kale was running on what might have been his 16th hour without sleep and a stimulant drink that tasted strongly of something synthetic, citrus, and was probably not good for him in any medical sense. The penetration rate dropped measurably within 12 hours. Dr. Yeva Moss, looking at the data, said a word in her own language that Kale did not have. She explained that it was an expression of extremely strong positive feeling that her language reserved for moments when something impossible had been accomplished by means of something extremely ordinary. He told her it was a good word. She told him she had never had to use it before. The counter signal design and the irrigation delivery method were transmitted to all 47 worlds within the day. The transmission went through official covenant channels, through Veil diplomatic infrastructure, and also through the independent operators network, the freight guilds, and every personal frequency Kale had in his contact list, because the covenant channels were reliable and the informal ones were fast, and in this situation they needed both. 3 weeks later, the Confluence sent something new. Senna called it a probe, not a physical object, but a focused extension of the Confluence's absorption signal, directed specifically and deliberately at the counter-signal infrastructure. It found the irrigation networks on 4 worlds and attempted to rewrite counter-signal's frequency from within the delivery system itself. 2 of the 4 worlds had enough lead time on the data to adapt the counter-signal before the overwrite completed. The other 2 did not. On those 2 worlds, the penetration resumed. Kale was on a different world, the 7th in the cluster, a trading hub called Vera Station, where he had been helping implement the irrigation delivery method when he heard about the 2 worlds. He sat in the cargo bay of the Mira's Luck with the hatch closed and the lights at half power and processed this information in the silence of a ship that was at this moment carrying only him. The 2 worlds had populations of approximately 800,000 combined, 800,000 people who were, as of now, in the early stages of the process that had consumed 60 million on Teth's rest. The process was slow. They had weeks, possibly months before full absorption. The countersignal method was not gone, only defeated on 2 worlds, and the defeat contained information about how the Confluence adapted that Dr. Yeva Moss and her team were already working with. The loss was real and was also not the end. That was the full picture. He sat with the full picture for a while. Then he opened the ship's channel to Senna. I heard, she said before he spoke. Yeah, the seers are saying that the adaptation it showed, the ability to target the counter signal specifically, means it is learning from us as we are learning from it, that each interruption gives it data. That's a reasonable concern, Kale said. Are you? She paused. You feel don't, he said. Not right now. Just tell me what the seers think we do. She was quiet for a moment in a way that was not empty but full of the consideration of someone choosing what to say. They think we need to make the counter signal variable, not a single frequency but an adaptive one that changes its own pattern too rapidly for the Confluence to model. Another pause, the way a human's emotional signature changes. Kale thought about that conversation with Thorn and the waiter, about the seer's assessment of human absorption resistance, about the variable, non-uniform, contradictory emotional frequency of a species that felt everything at once and couldn't be predicted. Can that be engineered? Kale asked. Doctor, Moss's team believes yes, in principle. The difficulty is generating a sufficiently complex variation pattern. It needs to be genuinely unpredictable, not randomly generated, because the Confluence can model randomness. Truly unpredictable, in the sense of arising from something that cannot be modeled. Kale was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Senna, when you touched me on the station, what did the reading feel like? From your side, she was quiet. Then, like trying to hold all the weather of a planet in both hands at once, could you reproduce it? The signal of it? Put it into a transmissible format? The pause that followed was different from her other pauses. It had the quality of someone who had arrived at a thought so unexpected that it required a moment before it could be processed as real. A veil reading encoded and transmitted as a signal carrier, the emotional frequency of a human, used as the variation pattern. It's unpredictable because it's not generated, Kale said. It's real. It comes from an actual person who actually feels things in the way the Confluence can't model. It would require the subject to maintain sustained contact with a veil witness, Senna said. Direct contact, because the encoding needs to be live. The frequency has to be genuinely current, not recorded, because recording flattens it into something predictable. You would have to. She stopped. You would have to be willing to be felt, fully, everything, for as long as the encoding takes. How long? Several hours. Kale thought about the moment on the Mira's luck when Senna had touched his wrist, and he had felt every feeling he had ever pressed down and gotten practical about surface at once. He thought about how that had felt. He thought about doing it deliberately, sustained, for hours. He thought about Kaleth. He thought about Mira and the caterpillars in the eastern sector. Okay, he said. Tell me where to bring the ship. The Irith situation had a secondary consequence that Kale only understood later, when he had time to think about things in sequence rather than in the urgency of one problem leading immediately into the next. What happened on Irith, the irrigation hack, the counter signal, the thing built from old infrastructure and new theory in 36 hours, traveled through the informal networks faster than any official communication. Couriers and traders and independent operators heard about it not as a scientific achievement, but as a story. A freight pilot walked into a xenobiologist lab on an agricultural world and found the thing that had been there all along, a 40-year-old water system. A signal that moved through the roots, something built from what was already in the ground. Stories moved faster than reports. Stories moved through the networks the way music moved through a culture, passed from person to person, reshaped slightly in the telling, arriving at each new listener with the energy of something that had been touched by human hands all the way down the chain. Within 2 weeks of the Irith deployment, 7 other worlds in the cluster had replicated the method using their own local infrastructure. None of them had done it exactly the same way. Helion III had used a thermal distribution network. Keth's world had used the irrigation system of a commercial greenhouse complex. Sethiel had done something creative, involving the city's cooling infrastructure that Dr. Yeva Moss described, when she heard about it, as technically incorrect but completely functional, which is the most human phrase I have ever used about a non-human solution. That was the thing about informal networks. The official channels moved the data. The informal channels moved the understanding of how to use it, which was different and faster and also often better because it traveled with the context of the people who had tried it and the specific ways it had worked and the specific ways it had failed. Kale had spent 15 years using those networks for cargo intelligence and market information and the location of operational fuel depots that weren't on official charts. It had not previously occurred to him that the same networks could carry something this important, and now that the possibility had become real, he could not unknow it. He filed this away as something to think about later. He sent a long message to Senna about it. She responded with a note that said the Veil Seers were already discussing the implications for how intelligence about the confluence should be distributed, and that the Council of Many Species was, her word, interested. He thought about what interested looked like at the Covenant, and decided it was probably several sessions and a formal subcommittee, which was fine. Subcommittees moved slowly, but they moved. The informal networks had bought enough time. He was in the middle of drafting a follow-up message when the news about the 2 worlds came in. He met Senna on the Vale Embassy platform at the Covenant. He sat across from her in the witness chamber, which was a small round room with no furniture except 2 seats and soft lighting that did not cast shadows, and she looked at him with those enormous dark eyes and said, "You do not have to do this." "I know," Kale said. "It will be." She paused. "It will not be comfortable. For you, I will be receiving everything. All of it. You cannot manage what surfaces, cannot choose what comes up. It is involuntary. You will feel things you have been avoiding feeling for a long time." "Yeah," Kale said. "I figured. Why are you willing?" He thought about this seriously. "Because it's the thing that might work," he said. "And because," he stopped. "Because I've been carrying it anyway. I've been carrying all of it for 3 years and it's been heavy. And I've been moving around it instead of through it." Maybe he stopped again. "Maybe it's time." Senna looked at him for a long time. "Vetch would be proud of you." "Don't," Kale said. Then, "Yeah, tell me what to do." She reached out both hands. He took them. What happened in the next 4 hours was not something he could describe in linear language afterward, because it was not a linear experience. It was the full depth of a person brought to the surface, not selectively, not in the edited version that you presented to the world or even to yourself, but in the complete and uncompromised version that existed beneath the management. He felt Vetch dying. He felt it without the buffer of practical necessity, without the immediate next task that had carried him past it the first time. He felt the specific weight of not having been there, which was different from grief and located in a different part of the body. He felt his mother singing, wordlessly, the tune that had become his own, the tune without words, the melody that was the only piece of earth he had kept intact, and the loss of her was enormous and clean and very old, the oldest thing in him. He felt the loneliness of the routes, which was real but also chosen, because he had chosen a life where the routes were the company. He felt the love he had for things he could not keep, for Vetch, for the specific smell of a particular bay on Caleth in the morning, for an 8-year-old he had been on a dead ship, and for the man who had decided that 8-year-old was worth keeping, for a 9-year-old girl who had more research to do on the caterpillars in the eastern sector and who was going to grow up and do it. He felt all of this fully without management, and it was exactly as heavy as he had always known it was, and he did not break. He felt something he had not expected. The grief was not separate from the love. The grief was the love, continuing. It was not the absence of something. It was the presence of something that had changed form. Vetch was not gone. Vetch was the decisions Kale made, the reflex to stop for beacons, the habit of detours, the knowledge that formal channels mattered less than fast ones, the truth that an 8-year-old who needed to be kept was worth the inconvenience of keeping. Vetch was in him, had been in him since he was 8 years old, and had become more central, not less, in the 3 years since the ship broke up and the crew member survived, and the man who had made both things possible did not. Senna held all of this for 4 hours. She wept, twice, the silent veil weeping that was just the overflow of what she was receiving, the tears of something too large to contain. She held it all and she encoded it, the full variable frequency of a human being feeling everything at once, and she made it transmissible. When she let go of his hands, Kale sat in the witness chamber for a few minutes without speaking. The room was very quiet. "Are you all right?" Senna asked. He considered the question honestly. "I think so," he said. "I feel," he tried to find the word, lighter. "You have been carrying the weight of grief as though it were separate from you," she said, "as though it were something added to you that did not belong. It is not. It belongs. It is part of the shape of who you are, and that shape is not diminished by it." "He was a good man," Kale said. This was the first time he had said this, exactly these words. In 3 years, the simplicity of it surprised him. "Yes," Senna said, "I know. I was just with him." The adaptive countersignal was deployed to the 47 worlds over the following 6 days. It worked differently from the first version. Instead of a steady counter frequency, it produced something that shifted and changed and doubled back on itself in patterns that arose from an emotional reality too complex and too human to be modeled. Dr. Yevamos's team called it, in their technical documentation, a variable resonance disruptor. The independent operators and couriers who transmitted it through their networks and who asked what exactly they were carrying were told, it's someone's feelings, engineered into a frequency. Most of them thought this was the strangest thing they'd ever heard. They transmitted it anyway. The 2 worlds where penetration had resumed stabilized, not immediately, not without continued effort and adjustment and several weeks of tense soil chemistry monitoring and several moments where it looked like it might not hold and it held. Both worlds stabilized, the penetration halted. The confluence tried twice more to adapt to the variable signal. Both times, the signal had already shifted past what it was adapting to. The variation was fast enough and genuinely non-predictable enough that the modeling it was attempting was always behind. It was trying to catch something that did not stay still long enough to be caught, generated as it was by the emotional interior of a being whose interior was specifically characterized by not staying still. And then a thing happened that nobody had predicted, though in retrospect the Veil Seers would say they should have considered it. The confluence withdrew from the outer worlds of the Helian cluster entirely. Not permanently, the Seers were clear about that, careful to frame it as a strategic repositioning rather than a defeat. But the filaments retracted. The penetration data across all 47 worlds began showing the same alkalinity normalization, the same microsol frequency, returning to its native pattern. Dr. Yevamos watched the data for 3 days before she would say it aloud. She called Kale when she was finally willing to say it. "It's retreating," she said. "I don't know for how long. I don't know what it's doing instead. But the cluster, right now, the cluster is clear." Kale was on a transit run when she called. The stars outside the viewport were the standard deep route stars, unhurried and indifferent, and the same as they always were. He sat with what she'd said for a long time. Then he asked the 2 worlds as they were most penetrated, Ire Eth Secondary and Keth's world, what's their status? Both showing full normalization. The mycorrhizal networks are rebuilding on their own. The biology is recovering. We're going to monitor for residual effects for a while, but she paused. They're intact, KL. They're intact. He said something that was not a word, which was the only available response. After he ended the call, he sat in the cockpit for a while. He thought about the Covenant's formal alert and the alert's passage through multiple sessions and considerable procedural resistance, and how it had started with him standing up without permission and saying something about a 9-year-old girl. He thought about Dr. Yeva Moss and the 36 hours of interface conversion and the moment when the system came back online. He thought about the witness chamber and the 4 hours and the feeling of being fully received, of putting down temporarily the management of his own interior and letting someone else hold the weight of it, and how that had been terrible, and also in the way that necessary things were sometimes both terrible and necessary, right? He thought about Vetch. Specifically, he thought about the thing he had never been able to fully understand about Vetch's death. The structural logic of it. Vetch had gone back for a crew member. The crew member had survived. Vetch had not. The mathematics of this had always struck Kale as a kind of story the universe was telling about Vetch, a story that was true to the shape of him. This is a person who did not keep track of the cost when someone needed help, and that is both the thing that made him who he was and the thing that killed him. The two were not separable. The love that made him go back, and the love that had kept Kale, and the love that had died in the cold of space were all the same love, just in different phases. He thought about what the Veil Elder had said. Purpose that grew from grief rather than despite it. He thought about the signal, the variable frequency, the thing that the confluence could not model because it arose from a being too contradictory to predict. Feeling love and grief and determination and fear and humor and stubbornness and gratitude all in the same moment, all in the same person, all coming through at once in the chaotic layered frequency of a species that had never developed a mechanism for feeling things one at a time. He thought we gave them Vetch, encoded and engineered and deployed through the roots of 47 worlds. We gave the confluence a signal it could not absorb. And it was the signal of a dead man who had never explained why he stopped for an 8-year-old on a ruined colony because he hadn't needed to explain it, because some things were prior to explanation. The Mira's luck crossed the dark. The stars were still there. He hummed, without deciding to hum, the tune without words. 6 months after that, Kel was back on Kaleth. He was there for a cargo pickup, genuine freight, pharmaceutical supplies going to a relay station 2 systems over, the ordinary business of the routes. He docked at Dara's Bay and paid for fuel and a berth. But before that, before Kaleth, on his way back through the outer passage, something happened that he had not expected and that he did not know how to process until afterward. He stopped at a junction relay called Crosshaven, which was one of the standard waypoints on the independent operator's circuit, a station that functioned as a refueling stop and a message drop and an informal meeting point for the couriers and scavengers and traders who ran the deep routes. He had stopped there dozens of times. It was the kind of place that had the specific energy of a location that was important to people who the official galaxy did not formally acknowledge as important, which gave it a character that more prestigious stations lacked. He docked at the standard berth and was walking toward the fuel management office when he noticed that there were more ships here than usual, significantly more. The main docking bay, which had berthing for 18 vessels, was full. The overflow bays, which were usually empty, had ships in them. There were vessels in the corridor with docking slots that were technically only rated for emergency use. He asked the fuel management operator, a Hellion man named Court, who had been at Crosshaven for 11 years, what was going on. Court looked at him with the expression of someone who had assumed Kale already knew something and was recalibrating. The Morrow Gathering, he said. The what? Court was quiet for a moment. You really don't know. I really don't know. Every couple of weeks, Court said slowly, someone puts out a call on the independent operators network, not official. No formal invitations, just a note that says, Crosshaven, if you're nearby, come through, and people come. Because he paused. Because of what happened in the cluster. Because of the protocol and the warning and the signal. Because people heard the story, and he stopped. There's a drink called the Morrow now. The place down the corridor started making it 3 months ago. Someone else started using the call sign Morrow route for independent operators, running cluster-adjacent paths. He seemed to be struggling with how to characterize what had happened. It just started. Nobody planned it. It spread the same way the warnings did. Kale stood in the fuel office of Crosshaven Station and said nothing for a long moment. They don't know you're here, Court said. I won't say anything if you'd rather not. No, Kale said after a moment. It's fine. He thought about Vetch. He thought about the Ravager funeral Senna had once described to him. Not exactly in those terms, but in a story she'd told about a Veil witness who had recorded a scene from a human cultural archive, a burial in space with fireworks, attended by people who had come from far away to honor someone who had been difficult and complicated and also beloved. She had described it as one of the most human things the archive contained. People came back for him, she had said, even though he was difficult, even though it was inconvenient. They came back. He walked into the main bay. There were 43 ships at Crosshaven that night. Their crews were in the common spaces, the eating areas and the drinking areas, and the informal corridor width gathering spaces that junction relays accumulated over years of use. There were humans and Torvans and 2 Helians and a being whose species Kale didn't recognize and 3 Veil, which was unusual for a place like Crosshaven. Some of them recognized him. Most of them didn't. The ones who recognized him didn't make a production of it, which he appreciated. He sat in the main eating area, and someone brought him the drink called the Morrow, which turned out to be a combination of 2 ingredients that should not have worked together, and somehow did. He drank it and listened to the conversations around him. People talking about the cluster, about the counter signal, about the adaptive variable frequency, and the soil monitoring stations and the irrigation hack on Irith. Talking about it the way people talked about things that had happened to them, that they had been part of, that had meaning in their lives. Not as history, as the ongoing story of the routes. A human courier sitting 2 seats away told a version of the Irith story that was not entirely accurate in its technical details, but was completely accurate in its emotional content, which was, Kale reflected, how stories usually worked. He didn't correct it. The technical inaccuracies were not the part that mattered. He stayed for 2 hours. He drank the Morrow drink. He listened. He thought about the 43 ships in the bays, and the people who had come through, not summoned, not ordered, not paid, just because a note had gone out on the network and they'd been nearby, and they'd thought, I should go through Crosshaven. I want to be with the people who were in that. He thought, Vetch would have understood this perfectly and would have pretended not to understand it at all, and would have left after 45 minutes and claimed he had a cargo to check, and would have been in the ship crying about it for the next 2 hours, while loudly insisting to an empty cockpit that he was not crying. He stayed for the full 2 hours. When he left, the station operator, Court, was at the door of the fuel office. He looked at Kale for a moment and said, 43 ships. That's not the record. The record is 61. KL thought about 61 ships at Crosshaven Junction Relay on a night when nobody summoned them and everybody came. Good, he said, and went to his ship. He was there for a cargo pickup, genuine freight, pharmaceutical supplies going to a relay station 2 systems over, the ordinary business of the routes. He docked at Dara's Bay and paid for fuel and a berth. Mira was 10 now. She had completed her survey of the Eastern Sector caterpillars and had moved on to the question of how the soil chemistry affected their pupation cycle, which was apparently a more complex and interesting question than it initially appeared. She explained this for 35 minutes. Kale listened. Dara brought them food. The caterpillars in the Eastern Sector, Mira said, doing something that the ones in the Northern Sector don't do. When the soil treatment happened, the one for the confluence thing, the Northern Sector ones slowed down, but the Eastern Sector ones didn't. They actually sped up. That's interesting, Kale said, and meant it. I think it's because the treatment changed something they use. But I don't know what yet. I need more data. She looked at him with the seriousness of a person who has identified a problem that requires sustained investigation. Will you come back? There might be updates. I'll come back, Kasel said. You keep saying that. I keep meaning it. Outside the window, Kaleth's sun was lower, the city beginning to shift from the clear brightness of afternoon into the particular golden quality of early evening. In the bay, 3 other ships were docked, a Torvan freighter with the markings of a guild he recognized, a small Veil diplomatic shuttle, and a human-registered vessel that he didn't recognize but that had the general profile of a long-haul independent, someone running the same kind of routes he ran, in the same kind of ship for the same kind of reasons. He thought about Vetch. He thought about the specific texture of being 11 years old on a half-dead ship, humming to fill silence, not knowing what would happen next. He didn't think of Vetch every day now. The daily quality of it had become something that arose less frequently, but felt, when it arose, somehow less like an open wound and more like a hand placed briefly on your shoulder. Warm, solid, the specific pressure of something real. Hey, Mira said. Yeah? Were you thinking about something sad? He looked at her. She was 10, and she had not even touched him, and she had still read something in his face that was precise enough to be accurate. He thought about what Senna had said in the witness chamber, what she had said about the shape of who you are, about grief belonging rather than being added, about weight that was not separate from love but was love, continued. A little, he said. A little sad and a little something else. What's the something else? He thought about it. Grateful, he said. I think that's the word. She seemed to consider this with the thoroughness she applied to things that interested her. For what? For this, Kale said. For the caterpillars in the eastern sector doing something unexpected. For the fact that you have more data to collect. For the fact that there's a next thing to find out. He paused. For a lot of things. Mira looked out the window at the golden evening, at the city that was still there, at the ships in the bay, at the Vale diplomatic shuttle that hadn't been there 6 months ago. Then she looked back at him. Me too, she said simply. Outside, a ship was coming in. Its running lights blinked. The bay lights came on to guide it down, the warm, steady orange of a docking approach, the kind of light that meant something was landing, arriving, finding its way to ground. Kale watched it come in and thought about routes, not any specific route, but the fact of them, the reality that everything in the deep dark was connected by the paths that ships made and the decisions that put them there. He thought about a beacon on a dying station. He thought about a woman in a communications bay with her hands pressed flat against a dark transmitter panel, giving the last of her light to call for help into the silence. He thought about what you do when you hear it. You drop out of transit speed. You bring the ship around. You cut through the airlock and you go in, not because it's safe or profitable or sensible, but because the beacon went off and somebody wanted to be found, and finding people is something you can do. Vetch's last lesson, the one he'd never said in words, the one he'd only ever demonstrated, was this. The universe was mostly dark and mostly cold and mostly indifferent to any individual's continued existence. This was not an argument against doing things. It was the whole point of doing them. You were fragile and brief and temporary, and you went anyway, and you carried the people who had gone before you, and you kept going until you didn't, and what you left behind was the shape of the space you had occupied, the routes you had run, the people you had warned, the 9-year-olds you had listened to, the moments when the decision to stop had been yours to make and you had made the right one. That was all. That was everything. That was it turned out. Enough. He left Caleth the next morning, cargo loaded, route plotted, running lights on against the dark. He flew out past the monitoring stations on the outer ring. 4 of them, upgraded now to 14, part of a network that connected to 8 other worlds in the cluster, and to a Vale observation post, and to the Covenant's formal alert system. As he cleared the atmosphere and the stars came clear and the deep dark opened around him, he found himself humming the old tune without words, the one that was earliest in him, the one that had been his mother's, and then been the thing he'd filled silence with when he was 11. And, frightened and didn't know what else to do, he had not hummed it on purpose. He had not decided to hum it. It was simply there, the way that the things which are deepest in you are simply there, requiring no decision, preceding deliberation, rising without permission into the silence of a ship crossing the dark. He hummed it for a while, and then he let it fade, and then the silence was the ordinary silence of the route, which was not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of distance, the quiet of the space between things that were connected by the fact of being looked for and found. He put the Mira's luck into transit and flew on. In the Vale historical record, the biological archive, the embodied memory that Senna carried and had transmitted, and that would now be held by the Covenant in its living library for as long as the Vale kept witness, there was an entry about a human courier on the deep routes of the outer passage in the early period of the confluence threat. The entry was not long. The Vale were precise archivists and did not inflate. It noted that the courier had stopped for a beacon on a dying station when stopping was dangerous and impractical and carried no commercial incentive. It noted the detour for warnings, the session of the Covenant, where protocol was broken in favor of a story about a child and an insect, the transmissions and the protocols and the soil treatment, and the counter-signal emitter built from irrigation infrastructure and a 40-year-old agricultural management system. It noted the witness chamber and the 4 hours and the encoding of a human's emotional frequency into the signal that the confluence could not predict. It noted that the confluence, which had consumed 60 million on Teth's rest, which had moved through the galaxy for centuries without successful resistance, had been interrupted on 47 worlds. That the 47 worlds were intact. That the chain of events that led to that interruption had begun on a dying station in the unmarked passage when a human heard a beacon and turned the ship around. The entry concluded with a note that was, for the Vale, unusually expressive. The human species is not the largest, the longest lived, the most technologically advanced, or the most diplomatically established of the sapient species of this galaxy. They are brief and fragile, and they know it. What we have observed, and what this record preserves, is that this knowledge does not diminish them, it propels them. They move through the dark, carrying their dead and their music, their love for things that will not last, and they stop for beacons, and they warn strangers, and they listen to children, and they sit in witness chambers and allow themselves to be fully felt and do not break. The confluence has consumed many. It has not consumed a human. We believe this is connected, and we are continuing to watch. The entry was sealed in the archive and transmitted to the Covenant's permanent record on the third anniversary of the Confluence's first interruption. Senna had written it herself with the care she applied to things that mattered. She had never told Kale it existed. She thought he would find it embarrassing and probably shrug it off, and then probably go hum something and plot a course somewhere else and refuse to sit with the significance of it for more than about 45 seconds before turning back to whatever needed to be done next. She thought this because she had felt the shape of him from the inside out, once in the moment before she knew his name, and again for 4 hours in a quiet room, and she knew him better than he knew himself in some ways. She was right about all of it. She found it, this correctness, this specific texture of knowing a person truly, one of the most beautiful things she had experienced in a life, spent feeling everything. She filed the archive entry. She went back to work. Outside the Vale Embassy's observation port, the stars were the same stars they had always been, old and cold and very far apart, and also, because of the ships moving between them, closer than they looked.